The Clearwater Valley in November of 1891 did not ease into winter. It arrived the way hard things always arrived in that part of Idaho, without announcement, without the courtesy of a gradual decline. One morning the ground was still soft enough to take a boot print, and the next morning it was iron. The sky lost its color by mid-month, settling into a flat gray that sat low over the mountains like a lid pressed down on a pot. Snow came before the end of the first week, not the gentle introductory kind that dusted fence posts and made children run outside, but the heavy, purposeful kind that filled wagon ruts and buried the lower fence rails and reminded every family in the valley that the season had arrived to collect what it was owed. Two homesteads had already surrendered to the cold by the time the first real storm passed through. The Hensley family, who had built too close to the creek bottom, where cold air pooled at night, packed what they could carry, and rode out before their wood supply failed entirely. The Dunbar place, half a mile east of the road, went dark before anyone realized the family had left. A neighbor rode over to check and found the door frozen open, a water bucket solid from rim to bottom, and a stack of wood that should have lasted 3 weeks already burned through. Whatever the Dunbars had planned for winter, winter had planned differently. In the cabins that remained occupied, fire burned without rest. Men fed their stoves through the night in shifts, and women kept children close to the hearth during the day, and still the cold pressed through the walls, the way cold always did, finding the gaps around window frames, creeping under doors, pulling in corners and along floors, until every room in every cabin had its warm zone and its dangerous zone, and the distance between them was measured in feet. Firewood became a currency more reliable than coin. A man's woodpile told you everything about how he expected the season to treat him. At the eastern edge of the valley, on a plot of land that sat slightly elevated above the creek drainage and caught the afternoon sun on its south-facing slope, something was happening that did not match anything else in the valley. A cabin was being built, or rather was being rebuilt. The original structure had stood for 11 years, long enough to acquire the particular lean of aged Idaho construction, and the man who had lived in it had decided that lean was no longer acceptable. What was going up in its place was not a larger structure, not a more elaborate one, not something that announced itself with size or decoration. It was a simple rectangle of lodgepole pine, nothing that would have drawn a second look from the road. But inside that rectangle, rising from a foundation that had been dug deeper than any builder in the valley would have recommended, was something that did not belong in any cabin the Clearwater Valley had ever produced. Elias Hartwell was 64 years old, and he was building it alone. He worked in the early mornings when the light was best and the cold had not yet deepened into the brutal midday temperatures that followed a clear night. His left shoulder had been damaged in a mining accident 12 years earlier, a partial collapse in a Colorado shaft that had taken 2 men entirely and left Elias with a shoulder that worked well enough in warm weather and became a source of steady grinding pain when temperatures dropped below freezing. He had learned to compensate. He lifted with his right arm as the primary mover and used the left as a guide, and he had developed a particular way of setting heavy stones that involved his knees and the angle of his torso more than his arms. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that a younger man would have found frustrating for its pace. But Elias had spent 18 years in mining operations, where patience was not a virtue but a survival skill, and he understood that slow and correct was the only speed that mattered when what you were building had to hold. The stone he was setting was sandstone, 8 tons of it, river cut, purchased from Harold Pruitt's general store at the north end of town in late October. He had arranged for it to be hauled to his property in 2 loads, and when the second load arrived and the driver stacked it in the yard, the pile looked excessive, even to Elias's eye, which was not an eye easily impressed by excess. 8 tons was more than twice what any cabin foundation required. It was closer to what you might use for a small commercial building. The driver had looked at the pile, looked at the modest cabin frame rising behind it, and departed without comment, in the particular way of men who have learned that other people's decisions are not their burden to understand. Elias spent 3 days sorting the stones before he laid a single one. He separated them by density, tapping each piece with the handle of his rock hammer and listening to the tone it produced the way a physician listens to a chest. Dense stone rang with a short, clear note. Porous stone produced a dull thud that told him the material would absorb moisture and crack under thermal stress. He set the porous pieces aside for the foundation walls and kept the densest pieces, the ones with the clearest ring, for the core. By the end of the 3rd day, he had identified approximately 4,000 pounds of stone that met his standard. He began building on the 4th day. The structure rising at the center of the cabin was not a fireplace in any form that the Clearwater Valley would have recognized. It was closer to a tower than a hearth, a thick rectangular column of stacked sandstone that measured 4 feet on each side and would eventually stand nearly 6 feet tall before it was finished. The firebox built into its base was modest, almost unremarkable sized for a small concentrated burn, rather than the large roaring fires that most valley cabins required to push any warmth at all into their rooms. But the stone surrounding that firebox was what made the whole thing different from anything built within 50 miles of the valley. The heat from the firebox did not take a straight path upward. Elias had designed a system of internal channels cut into the stone passages that forced the hot gases from combustion to travel laterally through the massive rock before they could rise toward the exterior chimney. The path of the smoke from the firebox to the open air was 3 times longer than a conventional chimney arrangement, and every foot of that path was surrounded by stone. The heat that would have rushed up and out of a standard chimney, carrying most of its energy directly into the atmosphere above the roofline, was instead forced to surrender that energy to the rock before it could escape. The stone absorbed it, the stone stored it, and the stone, once it had absorbed enough, would release it slowly back into the room, not in the immediate, intense, and rapidly diminishing wave that a conventional fire produced, but in a long, steady, even radiation that would continue for hours after the last flame had died. He knew this because he had watched it happen at an industrial scale for nearly 2 decades. The boiler systems in the Colorado mines where he had worked as a younger man were insulated with sandstone packing, specifically because the engineers who designed them understood that stone absorbed thermal energy and released it on a delayed curve. A boiler wrapped in dense stone ran more efficiently than an unwrapped one. The heat did not disappear between firing cycles it accumulated in the stone, and the stone became a buffer between the intense heat of the fire and the ambient temperature of the surrounding environment. Elias had spent 18 winters going down into those shafts and spending his shifts near machinery that stayed warm long after the fires that heated it had been reduced to coals, and somewhere in those years, the knowledge had settled into him so thoroughly that it no longer felt like knowledge. It felt like obvious fact. What he was doing in the Clearwater Valley was not invention. It was translation, taking a principle that operated at the scale of industrial machinery and reducing it to the dimensions of a home. He had no formal engineering credentials. He had never studied thermodynamics from a textbook. What he had was 18 years of direct observation and a series of technical journals that his wife Margaret had ordered for him from a Philadelphia publishing house, beginning in 1875, the year they married, because she had understood even then that his mind required a particular kind of feeding that the valley could not easily provide. Margaret had died in September. The doctor who came out from the county seat had been honest in the way that some doctors are honest when the outcome is already settled directly without softening, because softening would have been a form of disrespect. He told Elias that the inflammation in her lungs had been present since early spring, and that the cold nights in June, when temperatures in the valley had dropped unexpectedly, had advanced the damage faster than it might otherwise have progressed. He said that a warmer environment, not dramatically warmer, just consistently warmer, fewer of the overnight temperature drops that the cabin experienced when the fire burned low, might have slowed the progression. He used the word might. He was careful about that, but the word stayed with Elias in the way that carefully chosen words sometimes stay, because the care itself signals that the speaker believes the unqualified version. Elias had not told anyone this. Not Raymond, not Harold Pruitt, not any of the men who had asked him in various ways why he was doing what he was doing. He answered their questions with practical language, efficiency, fuel economy, heat retention, because those things were true and sufficient, and because the actual reason was not theirs to carry. It was his. The cabin he was building was not an experiment, and it was not a demonstration, and it was not an argument against the way the valley had always done things. It was a debt. It was the cabin Margaret should have had 11 years ago when they first settled on this land, and which he was only now building because it had taken him that long to find the reason to open the box of knowledge he had packed away after the accident in Colorado and refused to unpack until grief made refusal impossible. The Saturday in late October when he went to Pruitt's to buy the second load of sandstone was a cold morning with a hard wind pushing out of the northwest that made the walk from the wagon to the store door feel longer than the 30 feet it was. The store was warm. Pruitt kept a good stove and smelled of coffee and coal oil and the particular combination of sawdust and cured leather that general stores accumulated over years. There were 6 men inside when Elias pushed through the door, most of them gathered near the stove, with cups, the morning gathering that served the valley as its closest equivalent to a newspaper. He knew all of them. He knew most of their fathers. Clifford Morse was sitting on the wooden bench along the east wall, with a coffee cup balanced on his knee and a posture that communicated without requiring any words that he was a man who had spent 55 years building things in this valley and intended to go on doing so. He was 68, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked as though they had been assembled for a larger man and then attached to him by accident. He had built more than 40 structures in the valley over 5 decades, from simple one-room cabins to the two-story frame house that the Caldwell family occupied on the North Road, and his reputation in the county was the kind that does not require maintenance because the structures themselves maintain it. When Clifford Morse told you something was built right, the conversation about whether it was built right was finished. Harold Pruitt, behind the counter, was a man of middle age and moderate opinions, whose primary skill was the accurate reading of his customers' states of mind, a skill essential to the management of the only general store within the 12 miles. He saw Elias come in and had the ledger open before Elias reached the counter. Elias ordered the second load of sandstone. Pruitt's pen paused above the ledger. The order was large enough to require confirmation, and the confirmation, when it came, produced a shift in the room's atmosphere that Elias registered without turning around. He heard the pause in conversation near the stove. He heard someone set a cup down. "What in the world do you need with 8 tons of river sandstone, Elias?" Pruitt asked the question with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. He was not a man who challenged his customers. "I'm building a heat battery," Elias said. He said it the way he might have said he was building a fence or repointing the foundation stones, as a simple statement of intent, requiring no elaboration unless elaboration was specifically requested. The store went quiet. Then Ernest Calloway, who built furniture from 3 generations of family tradition and had opinions about construction that he offered freely on all occasions, laughed in a short, sharp burst that contained more surprise than mockery. Then someone else laughed. And by the time Elias turned around, the room had reorganized itself from morning gathering into something with a sharper attention, the way a group of men reorganizes when something has been said that requires collective processing. Morse had not laughed. He was looking at Elias with an expression that contained less amusement than the others, and more of something, the particular focused attention of a man cataloging information he has not yet decided what to do with. "Where are you putting us the firebox?" he asked. "Center of the cabin," Elias said. That produced the second laugh, louder than the first, and this time Morse joined it, though his version was quieter and stopped sooner. He set his coffee cup on the bench beside him and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "Fireboxes go on exterior walls," he said with the patience of a man explaining something to someone who should already know it. "That's how the flue drafts. Put it in the center and you'll fill the room with smoke before the stone has time to heat. That's not a battery, that's a chimney fire waiting to happen." Elias reached into his coat pocket and produced a piece of paper folded twice. He unfolded it on the counter, a hand-drawn diagram, precise in its proportions, showing the cross-section of the stone core with the internal channel system marked in a different pencil stroke than the outer walls. He had drawn it at the kitchen table over 3 evenings in late September, working from memory and from the margins of the technical journals, and it showed not only the arrangement of the stone, but the path of the combustion gases through the internal passages before they reached the exterior flue. Morse stood up and walked over. He looked at the diagram without picking it up, studying it in the manner of a man who reads construction drawings the way other men read text, not passively, but with the active engagement of someone checking each element against an internal standard. The room was quiet while he looked. Nobody rushed him. His opinion, when it came, would carry the weight that 55 years of correctness had accumulated. "Stone that thick will absorb the heat before it reaches the room," Morse said finally. "You'll burn wood heating the rock, and the rock will sit there holding it while you freeze. Stone doesn't give heat back fast enough to warm a living space." He straightened up. "You'll be out of wood before Christmas." "I expect to use less than half a cord a week," Elias said. The room reacted to that the way rooms react to a number that contradicts everything the assembled company believes to be true. Morse burned close to 3 cords a week in his own cabin, which was considered well heated by Valley standards. Ernest Calloway burned 2.5 and still complained about cold corners. Half a cord a week in a Clearwater Valley winter was not a heating budget. It was a fantasy. "Books don't keep a man alive when the January wind comes down from Canada," Morse said. He said it without cruelty. There was something in the delivery that was almost gentle, the tone of a man delivering a verdict he would have preferred not to deliver. "I've seen what that cold does to structures built on theories that haven't been tested by an actual winter, and I've buried the theories along with the men who trusted them." He picked up his coffee cup. "I respect that you've thought it through. I'm telling you the thinking is wrong." Calloway nodded once definitively the way he nodded when a structural argument had been settled. The other men near the stove had the look of people watching a chess game whose outcome they already knew. Elias folded the diagram and put it back in his coat pocket. He paid for the sandstone. He thanked Pruitt. He pulled on his gloves and walked out through the door into the northwest wind. He heard, just before the door closed behind him, another ripple of quiet laughter from somewhere near the stove. He had heard that specific quality of laughter before, not at strangers, but at people who were known quantities whose lapses from common sense produced the particular social warmth of a shared and affectionate certainty. He was not a stranger to the valley. He had lived here for 11 years. He had attended the same church, bought from the same store, borrowed tools from, and lent tools to the same families. What he heard in that laughter was not hostility. It was something more unsettling than hostility. It was the sound of a community exercising its collective judgment about what was possible and finding his proposal comfortably outside the boundary. The second thing Elias noticed walking back to his wagon through the wind was that Morse had not dismissed the diagram without looking at it. He had studied it. He had leaned over the counter and spent a full minute looking at a hand-drawn cross-section of a stone heating system, and only then had he offered his objection. A man who believed he was looking at the work of a fool does not spend a minute studying it. Elias stored that observation the same way he stored all observation that had not yet found their proper context in a part of his attention that continued working on things quietly below the level of active thought until the context arrived. What nobody in Pruitt's store knew, and what Elias had not chosen to explain, was that Morse's objection that stone absorbs heat before it can warm the room was precisely the mechanism Elias was depending on. The stone was supposed to absorb the heat. That was the entire point. A conventional cabin fireplace pushed heat into the room immediately and intensely, and the room absorbed it, and within an hour of the fire burning out, the room temperature had collapsed back toward the outside temperature because there was nothing in the structure with sufficient thermal mass to hold what the fire had briefly deposited. The cabin was not a battery, it was a pipe. Heat went in one end and out the other, and the fire had to run constantly to compensate for what the walls and the cold air were constantly taking away. What Elias had watched in the Colorado mines was different. The stone surrounding the boilers absorbed heat slowly over hours, and then released it slowly over more hours. The relationship between fire and stone was not immediate. It operated on a delayed curve that most people who experience fire primarily as something that produces warmth right now found counterintuitive. You had to be willing to watch a process unfold over a timescale longer than the one that human comfort usually tolerated before the principle became visible. Most people never waited long enough. They fed the fire because the fire was cold, and the fire kept them warm while it burned, and they never questioned whether there was a different way to ask the same question. Elias had waited. He had spent 18 winters waiting in the specific sense of a man who watches industrial processes across full cycles and sees what the short view misses. He was not translating theory into practice. He was translating observation into a different scale. Construction resumed after the second stone delivery. The internal channel system was the most technically demanding part of the work, requiring him to cut the routing passages into individual stone courses before laying them, fitting each piece against its neighbors, with a precision that demanded both physical control and the ability to hold the three-dimensional geometry of the entire system in his mind while working on a single 4-inch section. His left shoulder ached steadily through the cutting work. He took breaks when the pain moved from constant to acute, sitting on an upturned bucket, with his back against the partially built core, letting the landscape settle him. The valley from his elevated position showed him the other cabins, the thin spires of smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, each one a measure of how hard the households below were working to stay warm. He counted the smoke columns in the mornings and noticed which ones ran heavy and which ones ran thin. The heavy ones told him the fire was new, recently fed, burning with fresh wood. The thin ones told him the fire was established, the wood reduced to coals, producing heat with less visible drama. By mid-November, the heavy morning columns were the rule. Families were waking up to cold rooms and rebuilding fires from scratch each morning, which meant the fires were going out overnight, which meant the rooms were dropping to near outside temperatures between last night's fire and this morning's. The cabins were not holding heat. They were borrowing it from the fire and returning it to the atmosphere the moment the lending stopped. One evening in the second week of November, with the stone core 3/4 complete and the first real cold of the season settling into the valley overnight, Raymond drove up the road from the south and turned into the property without advance notice. He was 38, his mother's son in face and voice, the same particular stillness that Margaret had possessed in her expressions, the same way of pausing before answering that had made her seem to people who did not know her well reserved, and to people who did know her deliberate. Raymond managed accounts for a supply company in Boise. He was good at his work. He visited his father twice a year when the roads allowed, and the visits had always had a quality of dutiful maintenance to them, not cold, not performed, but structured around a mutual understanding that the two of them occupied adjacent but not overlapping territories of experience, and had long ago made a practical peace with the distance. He stood outside the cabin frame in his city coat, looking at the stone core rising from the center of the construction, and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own statement. It's a thermal mass heating system, Elias told him. He used the technical phrase deliberately because Raymond responded better to precise language than to explanations that began with analogy, and because the precise language was accurate. The stone absorbs heat from a small fire and releases it slowly over 8 to 12 hours. The cabin maintains a consistent temperature through the night without requiring continuous fuel. Raymond walked around the perimeter of the structure looking at the stone core from multiple angles. He put his hand on one of the upper courses, testing it the way a person tests ice on a pond, not for structural confidence, but for the confirmation of something physical to hold against the abstract. "Who else has done this?" he asked. "Not in this form at this scale in a residential structure," Elias said. Raymond turned around. His expression had not changed, but something in it had recalibrated the particular micro-adjustment of a person who has just registered that the information they have received is more extreme than the information they prepared for. "So you're testing a theory that has never been tested." "I'm applying a principle that has been tested extensively at an industrial scale," Elias said. "The principle is not in question. The application is new." "With your inheritance," Raymond said. "Not an accusation. A fact deployed with the quiet precision of a man who has thought about it before arriving." Elias acknowledged that without argument. "If this fails," Raymond said, and his voice carried the careful flatness of someone maintaining control of a conversation they feel moving toward a place they don't want it to go, "the inheritance is gone. The land doesn't generate enough income to cover the losses. You understand what that means." He paused. "I'll have to sell it. I'll have to bring you back to Boise. You understand that?" The word "I'll" was the thing that stayed with Elias after Raymond drove back down the road. Not "we," not the provisional, uncertain "we" of a conversation between people navigating a shared problem, but "I'll" with its unambiguous grammar of control. Raymond believed with the sincere and particular anxiety of a son watching an aging father make a large and risky decision that he was the responsible party in this situation. That his father had become in some categorization that Raymond had not fully articulated even to himself, a variable requiring management. Elias went back to setting stone. The fourth course of the internal channel system went in that week, and with it, the structure crossed the threshold from appearing to be a large pile of rock into appearing to be something that had been deliberately designed. The routing passages became visible as intentional geometry rather than accidental gap, and the whole mass acquired a kind of logic that announced itself to the eye, not the logic of beauty, but the logic of function, the way a well-made tool looks right before you have been told what it does. A second visitor arrived uninvited on a Friday morning near the end of November. Clifford Morse had apparently decided that whatever impulse had sent him to study the diagram in Pruitt's store deserved a direct answer, and he came to get it without ceremony or advance notice, appearing on horseback at the edge of the property and dismounting while Elias was in the middle of cutting a channel passage into a section of upper course stone. Morse walked through the open cabin frame and stood in front of the stone core. He was quiet for a long time. He walked its perimeter as Raymond had done, but with different attention. Raymond had been assessing risk while Morse was assessing structure. He tapped the stone with his knuckle at several points. He crouched and looked at the lower channel openings. He stood up and tracked the geometry of the flue path with his eyes from base to where the exterior chimney connection would eventually run. "Where did you learn to cut channels like this?" he asked. "Colorado mines," Elias said. "Boiler insulation work." Morse nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing information not agreeing with it. He was quiet again for a moment. Then, "Industrial boiler systems operate at temperatures and pressures that a residential firebox will never approach. The stone mass that's effective for an industrial application may be entirely disproportionate to a residential scale. The physics that work at that scale don't automatically translate downward. The principle of thermal mass storage doesn't change with scale," Elias said. "The ratio of firebox output to stone volume requires adjustment. I've calculated it." "On paper." "Yes." Morse looked at the stone core once more, and then he looked at Elias. The expression was not what it had been at Pruitt's, not the confident dismissal of a man whose experience has insulated him against uncertainty. There was something in it that Elias recognized because he had seen it in the mirror in the weeks after the Colorado accident, when the confidence that had carried him through 18 years of underground work had been replaced by something more cautious and more honest. It was the expression of a man who is not entirely certain of the ground he is standing on. "The flue will fail to draft in cold weather," Morse said. "A long horizontal run with those turns will lose velocity. The smoke will drop before it exits." "The channel angles compensate for the velocity loss," Elias said. "There's a supplemental draft valve at the base of the exterior run." Morse looked at the diagram Elias produced from his coat, the same one from Pruitt's store now supplemented with additional calculation notes in the margins. This time he picked it up. He held it for nearly 2 minutes, turning it once to examine a channel detail from a different orientation. He set it back down on the flat stone where Elias had placed it. He did not say the system would work. He did not say it wouldn't. He walked back out through the open cabin frame and mounted his horse and rode back toward the valley road. At the edge of the tree line, before the road bent south, he stopped and turned and looked at the construction once more. The look lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then he turned and rode on. Elias watched the space where the horse had been after it disappeared behind the trees. He knew what that look meant. It was the same look he had given the Colorado boiler system the first time he noticed on an early morning shift change that the stone surrounding the steam pipes was warmer than the air temperature in the shaft would explain. It was the look of a person whose existing framework has been handed something that does not fit neatly inside it. Morse had not seen a fool's project when he looked at the stone core. He had seen something he did not yet have the language for. That was a different problem, and it was Morse's problem to solve. Elias turned back to his cutting work. The stone core was finished on the last day of November, 3 days before the early storm that most of the valley had not expected for another 2 weeks. The exterior chimney connection was completed on the same day, sealed against weather, and the cabin walls were closed up and chinked within 48 hours after that, with the timing of a man who knew that what he had built required a protected environment to demonstrate what it could do. He lit the first fire on the 3rd of December, a modest arrangement of 5 medium logs in the firebox, nothing that would impress anyone watching size for testing rather than for warmth. He sat on the floor beside the stone core with his back to it and his hand flat against the surface and waited. The fire burned for 90 minutes. He let it go out naturally. He left his hand on the stone. 2 hours after the fire was cold, the stone was warm. Not the remnant warmth of recent combustion, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that had mass and depth to it, that came from within the stone rather than from its surface. He pushed to his feet and checked the far corner of the cabin, the northwest corner that caught the worst of the prevailing wind in winter and was always the coldest spot in any structure. 58 degrees. The fire had been out for 2 hours. Outside, the temperature was 17 degrees. He sat down again with his back against the core. He opened the Technical Journal Volume 4 of the Philadelphia series, the one Margaret had ordered in 1878, to a page near the middle where his own notes ran along the margins in the particular cramped shorthand he had developed in the mines for writing in limited light with limited space. At the bottom of the right-hand margin on page 34, in a different hand than his own lighter and more assured, were 5 words, "Can this warm our cabin?" And below that, an initial, M. He had not remembered that she had written it. He sat with the journal open on his knees for a long time, long enough for the darkness in the corners of the room to deepen into full evening, and for the temperature in the cabin to continue rising from the stone past 60 towards 65, while outside the first real cold of December pressed against the walls and found to its apparent confusion that the walls were not giving way. He closed the journal. He did not light another fire that night. He did not need to. Harold Pruitt came by the following afternoon wearing his heavy coat and the expression of a man who has decided that the most practical response to an interesting rumor is to investigate it directly. He stepped into the cabin and stood in the middle of the room. He looked around. He looked at the thermometer Elias had mounted on the interior wall, 62 degrees. He looked at the stove coal visibly unused since the previous evening. He walked to the stone core and placed his palm flat against it. He held it there. "How long since you had a fire?" he asked. "Since last evening," Elias said. Pruitt moved his hand along the stone. He walked to the northwest corner and back. He stood in the middle of the room with the particular stillness of a man whose practical mind is working through the arithmetic of what his senses have just reported. Outside, the temperature was 21 degrees. Inside, 62. Fire last lit 18 hours ago. He did not say much when he left. He thanked Elias for showing him. He walked out to his horse and stood beside it for a moment before mounting, looking back at the cabin with the expression of a man revising something, not a small revision, not a footnote, but one of the foundational entries in a long-maintained ledger of what was and was not possible in the Clearwater Valley in winter. On his way home, Harold Pruitt stopped at Clifford Morse's house. He went inside. He told Morse what he had seen and what the thermometer had read and how long the fire had been out. He delivered the information without editorializing because he was a man who knew the difference between reporting and advocating. Morse was quiet for a moment after Pruitt finished. Then he said, "We haven't hit the real cold yet. Wait until January." It was not the confident dismissal it would have been 6 weeks earlier in the store when the diagram was still just marks on paper and the stone was still just stone in a yard. There was something underneath the words now, not doubt exactly, but the absence of the certainty that had been there before. Pruitt heard it. He was a man who made his living reading the states of mind of the people who came through his door, and he heard the difference between what Morse said and what was behind it. He rode home without pressing the point. January, Morse had said, January would come. And when it did, whatever was true would make itself known in the only language that the Clearwater Valley had ever trusted, not argument, not theory, not diagrams on paper, but the unarguable arithmetic of temperature and time, and the wood that was left in the pile when the morning came. Elias Hartwell, at the eastern edge of the valley, went to sleep that night in a cabin that had not had a fire in nearly 20 hours and was still holding 60 degrees against a 20-degree night. He did not think about Morse or Pruitt or the men at the stove in the general store. He thought about a margin note in a technical journal, 5 words in a hand he would have recognized in any light. He thought about the years he had spent not building this, and the 1 year he had finally built it, and the distance between those two things that no amount of correct temperature readings could fully close. He slept. The stone worked quietly in the dark, releasing what it had stored, keeping the room above the threshold at which a person wakes up cold. Outside, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees before dawn. Inside, it stayed at 58. The difference between those two numbers was not magic, and it was not luck. It was the patient arithmetic of mass and heat running its calculation without interruption, without doubt, without any need for the approval of the valley that had laughed at it 6 weeks ago in a warm store on a cold morning. The real test had not yet come. But the stone was ready. The cold that arrived on the evening of December 23rd moved differently than the cold that had preceded it. The earlier cold of the month had been what valley residents called working, cold, uncomfortable, demanding the kind that required attention and preparation, but that a well-supplied household could manage without crisis. What came down from the north on the 23rd had weight to it, a density that the body registered before the thermometer confirmed it, the way a person registers the presence of deep water before they can see the bottom. Smoke from every chimney in the valley went straight up without bending because there was no wind, just a settled, deliberate pressure of cold air that had traveled from somewhere far north of Idaho and arrived with the patience of something that did not need to hurry. Elias had been monitoring his own thermometer twice daily since the first week of December, recording the numbers in a composition notebook with the methodical consistency of someone who understands that a single data point is an anecdote and a sequence is evidence. By the evening of the 23rd, the exterior reading was minus 14 degrees and dropping. He added 2 medium logs to the firebox at 8 in the evening, banked the coal bed carefully, and went to bed. The stone core had been in regular operation for 3 weeks by then, and he had developed an accurate intuition for its behavior, how long it required to reach full thermal saturation after a period of reduced firing, how the interior temperature curve flattened once the stone was fully charged, what the minimum input was to maintain the plateau through a given exterior temperature range. He had filled 11 pages of the composition notebook with these observations. The stone was behaving exactly as he had calculated it would. He slept without concern. He woke at 2 in the morning because the air tasted wrong. The smell reached him before consciousness fully assembled, sharp particulate, the unmistakable invasion of combustion gases moving in a direction they were not supposed to move. He was out of bed and across the room before he was entirely awake, operating on the reflex of a man who had spent 18 years in environments where the wrong smell in the air was the difference between walking out and not. The firebox damper was closed. He confirmed that by feel in the dark before he lit the lamp. The firebox itself was not the source. The smell was coming from the upper section of the stone core, from the area where the internal channel system connected to the exterior flue run. He had anticipated this possibility. He had designed the supplemental draft valve at the exterior chimney connection specifically to handle what was called a cold stack event, a condition where the flue gases lost enough velocity in a long horizontal run that a sudden change in exterior wind pressure could reverse the draft direction. He had not expected to need it in December. He had assumed the first serious test of the valve would come in January or February, when the temperature differential between the interior channel gases and the exterior air was at its maximum. What he had not fully accounted for was a specific combination: extreme cold, no wind, and a particular atmospheric pressure configuration that the valley's geography produced when cold air pooled in the drainage and backed up against the eastern ridge. The valve required adjustment from the exterior, a half turn on a brass fitting mounted at the base of the chimney stack above the roofline. In reasonable weather, this would have been a minor inconvenience. At 2 in the morning, with the temperature at -17 and a left shoulder that had been announcing its objections to the cold since sundown, it was a different proposition. He dressed completely, including the heavy wool coat and the lined gloves that restricted his hand movement, but were the difference between functional fingers and the kind of cold-damaged hands that did not grip properly for 2 days after. He went out through the cabin door into the dark. The cold hit him the way cold hits a person who is warm, not gradually but all at once, as though the temperature were a physical barrier he had passed through rather than a gradient he had entered. He moved around the cabin wall to the chimney base and found the fitting by memory, because the lamp he had carried outside cast enough light to see his own hands, but not much beyond them. The half-turn required more force than the original installation had suggested it would. The brass had contracted in the cold and the threading was stiff. His left shoulder transmitted the effort as a sustained grinding objection that he acknowledged and ignored. He completed the turn. He went back inside. The smoke smell dissipated over the next 20 minutes. He sat on the floor with his back against the stone core, still warm, holding the heat of the evening's firing with the steady reliability he had come to trust, and waited until the air was clean before he was willing to go back to bed. His hands had stopped feeling cold by then, but the shoulder continued its complaint, and he sat in the particular stillness of a person managing pain that is not serious enough to require action, but is persistent enough to demand acknowledgement. The room around him was 54 degrees. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 19 below. He did not lie back down immediately. He sat with his hand on the stone and thought about the draft valve, about the specific atmospheric conditions that had triggered the event, about whether there were modifications to the channel geometry that would reduce the vulnerability to pressure reversal without compromising the heat exchange efficiency. He was not frightened by what had happened. He was interested in it in the specific technical way that a person is interested in a system's failure mode when the failure mode reveals something about the system's behavior that the design phase had not fully predicted. The stone was doing exactly what he had designed it to do. The flue management was the variable that required refinement. He made notes in the composition book by lamplight for 20 minutes, recording the atmospheric conditions, the timing, the corrective action, the outcome. Then he went back to bed. He did not tell anyone about the event on Christmas Eve morning. He went to Pruitt's store for a few small items and spoke with 3 neighbors and declined an invitation to Christmas dinner at the Callaway place with the explanation that he had work to attend to. None of this was unusual. He had been declining social invitations with the same explanation since October, and people had stopped attaching significance to it. What he did not say was that the event had been in the 20 minutes he sat on the floor, waiting for the air to clear, the closest he had come to abandoning the entire project. Not because the problem was unsolvable. He had solved it in 20 minutes. But because he was 64 years old with a damaged shoulder alone, on a property at the edge of a valley in the middle of an Idaho winter, fixing a brass fitting in the dark at -17 degrees, and the possibility that he might not always have the physical capacity to manage whatever the system presented him with next had arrived with a clarity that sitting on a warm floor at 2 in the morning was particularly suited to producing. The stone had been warm behind his back. That was what had shifted the balance. Not optimism, not determination, not the particular stubbornness of a man who has invested too much to quit, just the physical fact of warm stone at 2 in the morning, when nothing else in the county was warm, the tactile confirmation that the thing he had built was working, sitting behind him with its patient, steady output doing its work regardless of his doubts. He went home after the store and split a quarter cord of wood that he didn't need yet because the rhythm of the work settled something in him that sitting still did not. The week between Christmas and New Year's arrived with a succession of clear, cold nights that pushed temperatures lower with each repetition, as though the weather were testing the valley's resistance by increments. Other households reported their wood consumption jumping by 30 to 40% over what they had budgeted for December. The cold was deeper than the season warranted, and the cabins were responding by demanding more fuel to maintain temperatures that were still, by any objective measure, cold. A family named Garfield, whose cabin sat on a low piece of ground 3/4 of a mile from the road, was already burning furniture. At Pruitt's store, the conversations had shifted in tone from the social complaints of early winter to the more practical, quieter discussions of people doing arithmetic. The wood suppliers in the county had not anticipated demand at this level, and several families had placed orders that could not be filled until the following week. The county's one physician, a Dr. Alderman, who maintained a small practice in the valley during winter months, had made 3 house calls in the last week for cold-related illness. He stopped in at Pruitt's on the 28th to ask whether there was any surplus wood available for families who could not afford market prices. Pruitt told him he would make inquiries. The accusation came from Morse on the same afternoon, spoken with the measured authority of a man delivering a professional assessment. He said it in front of 9 people, including Pruitt Callaway, and 4 men whose families were among those struggling hardest with wood supply. The thesis was specific. Elias Hartwell was burning anthracite coal purchased from a supply contact in Colorado, hidden within the stone walls of the cabin, where it could not be detected by a casual visitor. The warmth that Pruitt had reported was real, but its source was not what Elias claimed. No wood-burning residential system could produce the numbers that were circulating in Valley gossip, and Clifford Morse, with 55 years of construction experience, was prepared to stake his professional judgment on that statement. The room received this with the seriousness appropriate to a claim made by Clifford Morse. He was not a man who speculated publicly without ground to stand on. Several people nodded. Someone said that it explained the numbers, that they had seemed too consistent, too controlled for a standard wood fire in an experimental system. Ernest Callaway did not nod. He stood near the back wall with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, the posture of a man conducting an internal argument that he has not yet resolved. He had been to the Hartwell property 11 days earlier, not an official memo, not something he had announced to anyone. He had gone in the early evening on a cold night, positioning himself outside the south-facing window, where the interior thermometer was visible from the yard, and spent 40 minutes in the dark observing. He had counted the trips Elias made to the woodpile during that period. There had been none. He had observed the firebox through the window, a small established fire burning with the quiet efficiency of a fire that has been burning for several hours on a partial load, rather than the full aggressive burn that coal produced. He had stayed long enough to feel, standing in the yard in -10 degrees, the warmth radiating through the cabin's south wall, not the intense localized heat of a structure burning above its normal capacity, but the diffuse, even warmth of something that was simply maintaining a consistent state. A man burning hidden coal to fake a thermal mass system would have had a different thermometer profile. The temperature would have been higher at night when the coal was burning and significantly lower in the morning when it burned out. What Pruitt had reported and what Callaway had confirmed by his own observation without telling anyone was a temperature that stayed consistent across the entire 24-hour period with only modest variations. That was not a coal fire signature. That was exactly what Elias had said it was. Callaway said nothing. He said nothing because saying something required him to contradict Clifford Morse in public, and he had known Morse for 30 years, and the professional relationship between a furniture builder and the man who built the cabins that held the furniture was a relationship worth preserving. He also said nothing because he had not announced his observation visit, and explaining what he had seen would have required explaining how he came to see it. He chose silence and told himself it was not a choice that harmed anyone. The accusation reached Elias through Raymond's telegram, transmitted through Pruitt's store, the only telegraph station in the valley, and received by Elias on the morning of the 30th. The message was 11 words: "People saying you're hiding coal in walls. This must end now." It was the kind of telegram a man writes when he wants to say more than a telegram allows, when the words he actually means are the ones crowding behind the words he sent, waiting to be said in person. Elias read it twice, folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and went back to the woodpile. He spent the evening of December 29th alone, which was the same as every evening, but the quality of the solitude was different that night, heavier with a specific weight that had less to do with the coal accusation and more to do with what the accusation represented. He had not built this system to impress anyone. He had not built it to prove anything to Morse, or to the Valley, or to the men at the stove in Pruitt's store. He had built it because of what the doctor had said in September about warmer rooms and slower progression, because of 5 words in the margin of page 34, because there was a debt that could not be paid to the person it was owed to, and that demanded to be paid somewhere, and this was the only direction that presented itself. He pulled the technical journal from the shelf and opened it to the page he had been opening it to on and off for 3 months. His own margin notes from 1877, the calculations and observations of a younger man who had not yet had any particular reason to apply them. And at the bottom in Margaret's hand, those 5 words and the initial that stood for the name, he still addressed the empty room within the particular private habit of a person whose 40-year conversational partnership has ended, but whose instinct to share things has not. What he found sitting at the table in the warm cabin on the evening of the 29th was not the grief he expected. The grief was too familiar by now, too integrated. Not a distinct event, but a permanent condition, like the shoulder. What he found instead was something sharper and more specific, a clear accounting of time. He had known in the form of these margin notes what stone could do in 1877. He had understood the principle in its industrial application for the entirety of his time in Colorado. He had come to Idaho in 1880, built a cabin with a conventional exterior wall, fireplace the way everyone built cabins, and spent 11 winters in a structure that was cold. Margaret had spent 11 winters in a structure that was cold. He had possessed the knowledge required to make it otherwise and had not applied it. And the reason he had not applied it was that after Colorado, he had closed the technical journals and put them on a shelf and declined, without examining the decision to revisit the work that the accident had contaminated in his mind. That was the thing the accusation had nothing to do with, and that sat underneath it like a stone beneath moving water. The coal did not exist. He was not burning coal. Those were simple facts that the Valley would confirm or not confirm on its own timeline. What could not be confirmed or denied by any outside inspection was the calculation that ran in him on quiet evenings, the multiplication of cold nights by 11 years, and the question of what the product of that multiplication might have changed if he had done this a decade earlier, or 2 decades, or when they first arrived in the Valley and the cabin was still new wood and anything was possible. He did not permit himself to remain in that calculation for long. It was not productive. The cabin was warm. The stone was doing its work. Whatever he had failed to do before did not eliminate the value of what he was doing now, and he had enough engineering in him to understand that dwelling on the earlier design does not improve the current build. December 31st arrived with another temperature drop and with Raymond's car appearing on the road from the south in the early afternoon. Elias saw it coming from the window and recognized it by the sound and the pace Raymond drove, with the careful deliberateness of a man who respects machinery and road conditions equally and is not in the habit of hurrying either. He had not sent word that he was coming, which meant the decision had been made quickly, probably the same morning after some communication or conversation in Boise that had pushed him past the threshold of intervention. He was not alone. The man who stepped out of the passenger's side was tall, perhaps 50, in a coat that identified him as someone who dressed for professional occasions rather than weather, and carried a leather satchel of the kind that contained documents. Elias, who had spent enough of his life in states and territories where men with leather satchels and professional coats appeared at property boundaries to know what they generally contained, took one slow breath and opened the cabin door. The man's name was Gerald Foss. He was an attorney with a Boise practice, and he said so with the practiced neutrality of a professional who has learned to deliver his credentials as information rather than threat, though both parties in the room understood the distinction was largely semantic. Raymond did not make extended eye contact when he came through the door. He looked at the thermometer on the interior wall, 68 degrees, and then at the firebox, which Elias had not lit since the previous evening, and then at the floor, and something crossed his face that was not the expression he had walked in with. Foss set the satchel on the table and opened it without theatrical pause. The documents inside were of the type used to establish legal management authority over a person's financial and property decisions, not a declaration of incapacity in the clinical sense, but its practical equivalent, a mechanism by which another party could assume oversight of significant decisions on the grounds of demonstrated poor judgment or diminished ability to assess risk. Foss described them in general terms. He was careful and accurate. He used the word protective several times. Raymond stood beside the stone core with his hand pressed flat against it and did not look at his father while Foss spoke. His jaw was set in the way that Margaret's jaw used to set when she had made a decision and was managing the discomfort of executing it. The resemblance in that moment was precise enough to make Elias briefly lose track of what the attorney was saying. When Foss finished his description, Elias looked at Raymond, not at the documents, not at Foss, at Raymond. "You drove 4 hours in winter road conditions with a lawyer," he said, "because people at a general store said I might be burning hidden coal." Raymond finally looked at him. "I drove 4 hours because you spent your inheritance on a system that nobody has ever successfully built, that the most experienced builder in this county says will fail, and that you are living inside alone at 64 with a bad shoulder in the middle of an Idaho winter. The coal story is—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "The coal story is what other people are saying. My concerns are older than the coal story." The room held the temperature that it had been holding. 68 degrees, rising slightly from the residual output of the previous evening's charge. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -22. Foss, who had said nothing since his summary, looked at the thermometer with an expression that had moved perceptibly away from the neutrality he had entered with. He stepped to the stone core slowly, like a man approaching something he is not sure he has permission to touch, and placed his hand against it. He held it there. Then he removed his hand and looked at his palm for a moment, the way people do when they have just felt something that doesn't match the map they were using. Raymond said, "When did you last have a fire?" "Yesterday evening," Elias said, "before 9 o'clock. Raymond absorbed this. He walked to the northwest corner of the cabin, the corner that in any structure in the valley was the reliable location of the coldest air. He stood in the corner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came back to the center of the room and stood next to the table with the open documents on it. He did not sign anything. He did not ask Foss to continue. He looked at the documents, and then he looked at the stone core, and then he looked at his father, and what was in his face at that moment was a complicated mixture of things that did not resolve into a single readable expression. Not apology, not capitulation, not relief, but some compound of all three that was still working itself out. He picked up the leather satchel from the table and handed it back to Foss. He said they would be going. Foss closed the satchel. He nodded once at Elias with the brief, genuine respect of a man who has just been shown something that changed the terms of the conversation he came prepared for. They went out through the door. Raymond went last. He stopped in the doorway with one hand on the frame and turned back. He looked at the stone core once more and then at his father. He left without speaking. But the documents went with him. The days between January 1st and January 8th moved through the valley with the accumulated damage of sustained cold that had no intention of relenting. The temperature progression was not a storm. There was no wind, no new snowfall, just the daily subtraction of degrees from a baseline that was already too low. -15, -18, -21, -24. Each morning, the valley woke to a number lower than the morning before, and each morning, the wood consumption calculations that families had done in October revealed themselves as insufficient by a wider margin. The Garfield family exhausted their fuel supply entirely on January 3rd and burned the better part of their interior furnishings through the 5th. A widower named Ames, who lived alone on the North Road, was found on the morning of the 6th with his indoor temperature at 31 degrees, 1 degree above the point at which his water supply would have frozen solid. His woodpile was empty. The Dr. Alderman made the trip out and found no serious cold injury, but noted in the account he later gave Pruitt that another night at that temperature would have produced a different outcome. Ames came into Pruitt's store to arrange for emergency fuel credit and said nothing at all for the first 10 minutes he was inside, just stood near the stove with his hands held out. Morse was burning through his supply at a rate that his 40-year experience of Idaho winters had not prepared him for, because this was not a 40-year winter. He was a careful and experienced manager of resources, and he had stocked generously by any reasonable standard. But the standard the season was applying was not reasonable by historical measure. He did not say this publicly. He did not say much at all during the first week of January, which was itself a form of communication to anyone who knew him well enough to read his silences. Carter Morse had driven out to the Callaway place on the 3rd of January to help move a piece of furniture, a practical job that had nothing to do with anything else, and on his way back had passed the Hartwell property on the Eastern Road. The smoke from the Hartwell chimney was thin and infrequent, not the constant heavy output of a structure fighting extreme cold, but the periodic light exhaust of a system operating within its design parameters. He had slowed the horse to a walk as he passed. He had looked at the cabin for a long time. Then he had continued home. He came back on the evening of January 8th without telling his father where he was going. Elias was at the table with the composition notebook when he heard the sound outside, not quite a footstep, the muffled compression of someone shifting weight in deep snow near the south window. He was not alarmed. The valley's population of large animals capable of producing that specific weight distribution in that specific location was small and mostly identifiable. He went to the window and looked out into the dark. Carter Morse was standing 6 feet from the glass with his coat collar up and his hands in his pockets, looking at the thermometer that Elias had mounted on the interior wall in a position readable from outside. He was not hiding. He was simply there in the dark and the cold, looking at a number on a thermometer with the focused attention of someone checking a fact rather than satisfying a curiosity. Elias went to the door and opened it. Carter came in with the particular combination of cold air and quiet embarrassment of a young man who has been caught doing something that is not wrong but is difficult to explain. He was 19 broad through the chest in the way that suggested his father's build would eventually arrive, with a face that was still more boy than man in its capacity for transparent expression. He stood just inside the door while the warmth of the room settled around him and said nothing. Elias poured coffee from the pot on the back of the stove, the small cast-iron auxiliary stove he kept for cooking and boiling water, separate from the primary heating system, and put the cup on the table. Carter sat down, his hands wrapped around the cup. He looked at the stone core. He looked at the thermometer, 67 degrees. He looked at the firebox, cold unlit since the previous afternoon. His expression moved through several stages of calculation before it arrived at a place of simple, factual acknowledgement. "My father says it doesn't work the way you say it works," Carter said. The statement arrived less as a challenge than as a piece of information he was putting on the table between them, something he had been carrying that needed to be set down somewhere. "I know what your father says," Elias told him. "He's been right about buildings for as long as I can remember." Carter's eyes were still on the stone core. He told me about the Hendricks barn, about the Caldwell house, about every structure that failed in this county, going back to when I was young. He was right about all of them. The fire in the auxiliary stove clicked softly as the metal settled. Outside, the temperature was pressing toward minus 27. Inside, the thermometer had not moved. Experience is worth everything, Elias said, right up until the moment it convinces a man that what he hasn't seen can't exist. Carter held the coffee cup for a while without drinking from it. Then he put it down and stood up and walked to the stone core. He placed both hands flat against it, fingers spread the way a person touches a warm surface they are trying to understand through contact rather than examination. He held the position for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Elias with the expression that Elias had seen once before in the lamplight, on the night he had first confirmed the system was working, looking at himself in the small mirror by the door. The expression of a person at the exact moment when a principle moves from theoretical to actual, when the body confirms what the mind has been considering. Carter left an hour later. He stood outside the door for a moment before walking to his horse, looking back at the cabin, once at the thin, infrequent chimney smoke against the dark sky, at the soft light in the windows, at the structure that was behaving in a way that 55 years of his father's experience said was impossible. He mounted and rode south toward the Morse property without looking back again. Elias stood at the door after it closed and listened to the sound of the horse diminishing in the dark. He thought about Carter at 19, sitting in the warmth with his hands on the stone, doing the arithmetic that his father had refused to do. He thought about what it cost a young man to see something clearly, when seeing it clearly required him to see past the man he trusted most. He thought about Raymond and the documents that had gone out the door unsigned, and about the gap between love and understanding that families spent generations trying to close. And he thought, not for the first time but with a particular precision, that the most expensive silences were the ones maintained by people who already knew the truth and chose not to say it. He went back inside. He sat at the table with the composition notebook and the lamp and the steady warmth of the stone working behind him in the dark. Outside, the temperature dropped to minus 27. The notebook was nearly full by then. 37 days of temperature records, morning and evening, interior and exterior wood consumption, per day time since last fire at each interior reading. The numbers told a story with the patience and reliability of numbers, without argument or editorializing, simply stating what had occurred. Elias did not know yet who would read them, or whether anyone ever would. He recorded them because that was what you did with a system you wanted to understand. You documented it consistently across conditions until the pattern was so clear that the documentation itself became the argument. He would not need to make that argument himself. January 9th was coming. He could feel it in the quality of the cold that pressed against the walls, not worsening, not threatening, simply present with the settled permanence of something that has found its place and intends to stay. The stone absorbed his lamp's small warmth and returned it with the amplifying patience it had been demonstrating for 5 weeks. He closed the notebook. He put the lamp out. He went to bed in a 65-degree room, while the rest of the valley shivered through another night that was extracting from every other structure exactly the toll that cold had always extracted, without exception, without mercy, without the slightest interest in what anyone had planned or built or believed. The exception sat at the eastern edge of the valley, with its chimney barely smoking and its stone core holding heat like a quiet argument that did not need to be made out loud, because in 12 hours the thermometer would make it for him. January 9th arrived the way the coldest days always arrive in the mountain valleys of Idaho, not with drama, not with wind or the theatrical violence of a storm, but with a stillness so complete that it registered in the body as pressure. Elias woke at 4:50 in the morning to a darkness that had a particular quality he had learned to read over 11 winters on this property, the flat, muffled darkness of extreme cold, when the air itself seemed to have frozen around every sound and the silence had a density that ordinary silence did not possess. He lay still for a moment before he moved, cataloging what his body reported. He was warm, not the relative warmth of a man who has burrowed deep enough into blankets to create a microclimate around himself, but genuinely evenly warm, the room-level warmth of an interior that had maintained its temperature through the night without assistance. He lit the lamp and looked at the thermometer before he did anything else. 64 degrees. He put on his coat before going to the exterior thermometer, not because the cabin required it, but because he was going outside, and outside required preparation that had nothing to do with the cabin's interior state. He opened the door. The cold that entered in the brief seconds before he stepped out and pulled the door behind him was of a caliber that the word cold did not adequately describe. It had physical mass. It entered the cabin's warm air the way cold water enters warm water, not mixing immediately, but displacing, pushing, asserting a prior claim on the atmosphere. He crossed the 3 steps to the exterior thermometer bracket on the south wall and held the lamp close. -32 degrees. He looked at the number for a moment. He had seen -27 in the composition notebook, the reading from the previous evening. 5 more degrees in the overnight hours, pushing past any mark the valley had recorded in more than a decade. He went back inside, closed the door, set the lamp on the table, and sat down. He opened the composition notebook to the current page and wrote the date, the time, the exterior reading, and then the interior reading, 64 degrees. He wrote it in the same even hand he used for every entry without underlining or emphasis, because the numbers themselves required no decoration. The firebox had last been lit at 8:30 the previous evening, a modest charge, 6 medium logs, the fire allowed to burn down naturally and left without reloading. That was 7.5 hours ago. The exterior temperature during those 7.5 hours had dropped from -27 to -32, a 5-degree fall in a period when the stone was already hours past its peak thermal output and delivering from its reserve rather than its primary charge. The cabin had lost 3 degrees of interior temperature overnight. 3 degrees. In conditions that had driven every other structure in the valley to the edge of what fire and wood supply together could defend. He made coffee. He sat with it at the table and looked out the south-facing window at the first gray light beginning to separate the ridgeline from the sky. The light came slowly, reluctantly, the way winter light came at this latitude and this time of year, as though the sun itself was conserving energy. He drank the coffee and thought about nothing specific, which was a state he had not been able to achieve easily since September, in which the warmth of the room seemed on this particular morning to make available to him in a way that felt like a small, separate gift from the stone. At 8 o'clock, he built a small fire, 6 logs arranged for efficiency rather than output, the kind of fire size for maintenance rather than recovery. Within 40 minutes, the interior temperature had risen to 68 degrees. He let the fire burn down to coals, set the damper to banking position, and at 9 o'clock put on his coat and walked to Pruitt's store. He heard the cold snap of frozen branches in the tree line as he walked, the sound that happened when the wood contracted past its tolerance. A sharp crack that carried for a quarter mile in the still air, followed by silence. Then another crack from a different direction. The road was packed snow over frozen ground, and his footsteps made a sound like breaking crockery. He passed 2 cabins with heavy chimney smoke and could see without stopping that both were burning at full output, the thick continuous columns of wood being burned hard and fast, the telltale signature of households fighting a temperature differential that their walls were not equipped to hold. The store held 7 men when he pushed through the door. The temperature inside was warm from the stove, but not the 68 degrees of his cabin, closer to 55, which was what a well-managed commercial stove produced in a large room with conventional walls in current conditions. The faces in the room were the faces of men who had been awake for hours managing fires that never produced quite enough. Frost on beards. Eyes that had the dry, reddened look of people who had spent the night in rooms where the temperature dropped low enough to produce dry air. Harold Pruitt behind the counter looked like a man who had been fielding questions since 6 in the morning and expected to continue until dark. The conversation stopped when Elias came in. Not immediately. There was a 2-second lag, the time it took for people to register that he had entered and to make the adjustment from whatever they had been saying to the particular awareness that the man who had been at the center of their conversations for 6 weeks was now physically present. Pruitt looked at him. Calloway, who was standing near the east wall with a cup, looked at him. The other men looked at him in the way of people who have been talking about someone and are now recalibrating in real time. Pruitt spoke first with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided in advance to be accurate rather than political. "How are you making out Elias comfortable?" Elias said. He said it simply without weight. One of the men near the stove, a rancher named Bedford, whose property sat in the cold air drainage at the valley's lowest point and who had therefore spent the worst night of anyone present, looked up from his coffee. "How much wood did you burn last night?" 6 logs at 8:30, Elias said. "Another 6 this morning before I walked over." The room was quiet in the way its room is quiet when the 12 logs is too far outside the range of expected answers to be processed immediately. Bedford had burned through 43 logs in the past 24 hours, and his cabin had still dropped to 31 degrees by 5 in the morning. Pruitt, whose store's back room served as his private quarters, had burned continuously and was sitting at 53 degrees behind him right now. Morse came through the door at 9:15. He had not been in the store when Elias arrived, and his entrance had its own quality, the particular entrance of a man who has been thinking about where he is going for a while before he goes there. He was wearing his heavy canvas work coat and the wool cap he wore in serious cold, and his face had the drawn look of someone who had not slept well. He saw Elias immediately. He did not change his trajectory or his pace. He poured his own coffee from the pot on the stove because he had been doing it for 30 years and Pruitt expected it. He stood near the stove with the cup and looked at Elias with the direct gaze of a man who has decided that what comes next is going to be said plainly or not at all. "What was your interior temperature at dawn?" he asked. 64, Elias said. Morse's cup paused halfway to his mouth. He lowered it. "Fire last burning. 8:30 last night." The room had gone completely still. Morse set his cup down on the shelf edge beside him. He looked at the counter between them as though the surface of it might offer him something useful, some prior piece of information that would make the numbers he had just heard fit within an architecture he recognized. They did not fit. He had built 40 structures in this valley across 55 years, and he understood with the precision of long experience exactly what those numbers meant and exactly what they required him to revise. He picked up his cup and drank from it. He looked at Elias steadily. "I said some things at this store 2 weeks ago," he said, the words deliberate and without rush, "that were not accurate. I said you were burning coal. I had no evidence for that. I said it because the numbers I was hearing didn't match what I believed was possible, and I chose the explanation that preserved what I believed rather than examining what was in front of me." He paused. That was wrong, both the claim and the reasoning behind it. No one in the room said anything. What Morse had just done in this specific room, before these specific witnesses as a man of his standing, was not a small thing, and everyone present understood that it was not a small thing. "I want to see it," Morse said, "if you'll allow me." They walked back to the property together, Morse and Elias, and after a moment's hesitation at the door, Pruitt and Calloway and 4 of the other men who had been in the store. Nobody announced that they were going. Nobody formally organized the group. They simply went in the way that men go toward things that have become more interesting than staying where they are. Carter Morse was already at the property when they arrived. He was standing outside the cabin door with his hands in his coat pockets. And when his father came around the bend in the road and saw him, there something passed between them. A look that covered ground neither of them would have known how to map in words. Carter stepped aside from the door without speaking. Elias opened it and stood back. They went in. The thermometer read 66 degrees. The firebox was cold. Morse checked it himself, putting his hand into the firebox opening and feeling the interior chamber, coming away with a hand that confirmed the absence of recent combustion with the same reliability as any instrument. He checked the wood box, less than a third of a cord present, for a full week's supply. He walked to the northwest corner and stood there for a moment, the same corner he had assessed in every cabin he had ever built, because it was the corner that told the truth about a structure's thermal performance. 64 degrees. The corner that was supposed to be the coldest point in any residential structure in the valley was 4 degrees below the room average and 32 degrees above the exterior temperature. He placed both hands on the stone core. He held them there for what seemed to the watching room like a long time, long enough for the heat to travel from the stone surface through his palms and register in the nerve endings that 55 years of construction work had taught to read material the way other people read text. Not the surface warmth of recently fired stone. The deep stored warmth of mass that had been accumulating thermal energy across days of operation and was releasing it now at the slow, patient rate of a system designed for duration rather than intensity. He turned to face Elias. His expression had traveled a long distance from where it had been in Pruitt's store on that October Saturday, and the distance showed not in shame, not in the theatrical humility of a man performing a reversal for an audience, but in the simple, cleared quality of a face from which a long-maintained position has finally been released. "I was wrong," he said. The words were flat and complete and required nothing added to them. Not partially wrong at the foundation. The principle, the application, the conclusions I drew from both. Calloway exhaled slowly from the wall where he was standing. It was not a sigh of relief exactly. It was the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding since he stood in a dark yard 11 days ago and counted the trips to the woodpile and said nothing. "I owe you an honest account," he said to Elias. "I saw your system working before Morse spoke at the store. I counted your wood use from the yard. I chose not to say what I'd seen." He was not looking for absolution. He was correcting a record that needed correcting with the particular integrity of a craftsman who builds things that are supposed to hold. Elias looked at Calloway for a moment. "I know," he said. "I saw your tracks in the snow." Calloway received that without flinching. It was in its way a more graceful response than forgiveness. The acknowledgement that the deception had been observed and set aside, that the relationship had room for what had happened without requiring that it be formally processed. Morse asked to see the composition notebook. Elias put it on the table and Morse stood over it, turning pages from the beginning, from the first week of December through the increasingly dramatic numbers of the past 10 days. He read every entry. He did not read quickly. The room waited with the patience of men who understood that what Morse was doing was not casual review, but the kind of careful examination that precedes a significant commitment, and that it should not be hurried. When he finished the last page, he closed the notebook and placed both hands flat on the cover for a moment, as though the gesture completed something. "I'm building a cabin for Carter in the spring," Morse said. He looked at his son Carter, who had been standing near the east wall with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and is now watching it happen. "The design I have draws well and builds straight and will last 60 years the way the structures I've built always last 60 years. But the people inside will be cold in January." He looked back at Elias. "I need your measurements. The firebox to stone ratio, the channel dimensions, the flue path geometry. All of it." "I'll give you everything I have," Elias said. Morse nodded once. 55 years is a long time to do something the hard way," he said. "It's not too long to learn the better way. A man who reaches that conclusion at 68 is luckier than the man who never reaches it at all." The 11 brutal days did not break after the 9th. The cold held through the 10th and 11th and 12th with the committed consistency of a weather pattern that has settled into a configuration and sees no immediate reason to change it. -29, -31, -28, the numbers varying by a few degrees day to day, but never retreating far enough to offer relief. Elias recorded every morning's data in the composition notebook with the same hand, the same format, the same absence of editorial comment. He let the sequence speak. Visitors came daily. Some came once and did not return, having satisfied their primary question. Others came back 2 and 3 and 4 times. Morse came 5 times across the 11 days, each time with his satchel and his measuring tape and specific technical questions that had evolved visit by visit from general to precise, the questions of a man who was not just verifying the system, but preparing to build it. He and Elias spent long hours at the table with the composition notebook and the technical journal spread between them, working through the geometry with the focused attention of two professionals who have moved past the question of whether a thing works and into the more interesting question of how to make it work better. On Morse's 4th visit, he looked up from a channel dimension calculation and said without preamble, "The east wall placement I recommended for 20 years, the corner firebox on the exterior wall, I recommended it because it worked. It kept people alive. It did the minimum required." He turned the pencil in his hands. "I never asked whether the minimum required was the best available. That's the question I should have been asking for 30 years. He set the pencil down. "You asked it." "I had a reason to ask it," Elias said. Morse looked at him for a moment. He did not press further. He was a man who understood that the reasons behind construction decisions were sometimes simpler than the construction itself, and sometimes vastly more complicated, and that either way, they were not always available for public examination. He picked up the pencil and returned to the calculation. The Briggs family, whose 2 children had spent a night in the cabin during the first week of January, came back on the 14th with a cake that Mrs. Briggs had baked in their own oven and a request from Mr. Briggs to understand enough of the system to make modifications to their existing structure. They could not rebuild the expense, and the timing made that impossible, but Briggs was a capable man with basic carpentry skills, and he believed he could add stone mass behind his existing firebox and extend the flue path enough to improve retention without a full reconstruction. Elias spent 2 hours at the table with him, working through what was feasible with an existing structure versus what required building from the foundation. Briggs left with a hand-drawn modification plan and a list of the stone characteristics to look for when selecting material. The cold broke on January 19th, not dramatically, but by degrees, the same patient graduation by which it had arrived each morning's reading, slightly less extreme than the morning before the temperature curve, reversing its 10-day descent with the same geological patience it had employed going down. The valley emerged from the cold snap the way people emerge from a sustained illness, cautious, slightly disbelieving of their own comfort, taking inventory of what had been lost and what it held. What had been lost, the Garfield family's interior furnishings burned for warmth. 3 wood supplies depleted past recovery, requiring emergency credit from Pruitt. 1 case of severe cold injury to a child recovered fully. The accumulated exhaustion of 11 days of continuous fire management in structures that gave back less than they were given. What had held the Hartwell cabin at the eastern edge of the valley, which had maintained an interior temperature above 60 degrees for every hour, of every one of those 11 days, burning less than a third of the fuel that comparable structures required. Raymond came back on the 22nd. He drove up in the early afternoon of a day that was cold, but no longer dangerous. the temperature hovering at -8 mild comparatively by the standard the previous 11 days had established. He came alone. He did not have the careful advanced preparation in his expression that he had carried in December. He had the expression of a man who has done a significant amount of thinking in a short period of time and has arrived at a place he did not expect to reach. He came inside and stood in the center of the room for a moment, taking in the temperature, the way he had taken it in before, not casually, but with the specific attention of someone adding a new data point to an ongoing calculation. 66 degrees. A small fire had burned in the late morning and been left to its own conclusion an hour ago. He did not comment on the number. He sat down at the table. The silence between them had a different quality than the silences of his previous visits. The earlier silences had been structured around what was not being said, the concern that Raymond would not name directly, the reason Elias would not explain. This silence had something resolved in it, or at least something that was no longer resisting resolution. Raymond reached into his coat and put an object on the table between them. Not documents this time, but a small package wrapped in cloth. I went through the books from the Boise property office, he said. Mother's correspondence files from the Philadelphia subscription. I found the receipt for the journal renewals. He paused. She renewed the subscriptions every year from 1875 until 1890, the year before she died. He looked at the wrapped package. She never stopped ordering them. Elias did not touch the package immediately. He looked at it. She believed in what you were doing, Raymond said. Before you believed in it yourself, or before you let yourself believe in it again. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't understand that. I should have asked you about her instead of coming up here with a lawyer. The word landed with the weight of something that had cost him something to say. I came up here to protect an asset. She would have been ashamed of me. She would have understood you, Elias said. She understood people who acted from fear. She just didn't let them stay arrayed if she could help it. Raymond looked at the stone core. He had looked at it in varying states of conviction on every visit at the first time, with skepticism, the second time with the involuntary acknowledgement of its physical reality, the third time with the complicated expression that had declined to resolve itself. This time he looked at it the way a person looks at something they have finally decided to see on its own terms. Not as an argument, not as evidence in a case he was prosecuting, just as a thing that existed and did what it did. Tell me how it works, he said. From the beginning, I want to understand it. Elias opened the composition notebook to the first page and set it on the table between them and began. He spoke for 2 hours. He started with the Colorado boilers, not the accident, but the principle, the years of watching stone behave at an industrial scale, and moved through the theory, the calculation, the specific reasoning behind each dimension of the system. Raymond listened with the focused quiet of someone who has not come to debate, but to learn, asking questions that were specific and structural, and revealed as the conversation moved forward a more considerable technical intelligence than Elias had credited him with. The account business in Boise was not engineering, but the mind that managed it well was the kind of mind that, given a different set of early inputs, might have become an engineer. At some point in the second hour, Raymond unwrapped the cloth package. Inside was a small notebook, not the technical journals, but a personal notebook in Margaret's hand, the kind used for household accounts and personal correspondence. He opened it to a page near the middle and set it beside the composition notebook, the two books opened side by side on the table. The page showed Margaret's handwriting, a list of observations dated about the cabin's winter performance, temperature notes, draft issues. The specific complaint repeated across several entries across several years that the northwest corner was always too cold in January. And at the bottom of the last entry, a question, Elias's Colorado Journal's the stone insulation idea, should ask him when the time is right. She had been watching. She had been recording. She had been waiting for the right time to ask about something. She had been reading about in the margins of his journals, and the right time had never arrived because he had been 50 years old when they came to Idaho, and 63 when she died, and the right time had been waiting somewhere in the middle of those years in a space that neither of them had known to open. Elias sat with both notebooks open on the table for a long time after Raymond stopped talking. The lamp between them made a small, warm circle on the two books. He put his hand on Margaret's notebook, not covering the page, but resting beside it, palm on the table, not possessive, just present. She would have made the system better, he said. It was not sentiment. It was a technical assessment. She had thought carefully about the problem for years. She had observations he did not have. The collaboration they had never managed to begin would have produced something more refined than what he had built alone, and he believed that without needing to qualify it. Raymond looked at the stone core. What happens to this cabin? He asked. I live in it, Elias said. The same as I have. Raymond nodded. The property questioned the selling, the Boise plan, the protective documents, had left the room without being formally dismissed, the way some things leave when the circumstances that produce them change enough that the things themselves no longer have anywhere to stand. Raymond stayed through dinner. He looked at the composition notebook's full data set before he left, running his finger down the columns with the careful attention of a man who now understood what he was reading. On the road south, halfway back to town, he stopped the horse and looked back at the cabin. He could see the chimney from where he stood, not smoking heavily, just a thin periodic exhaust from the banking fire barely visible against the pale January sky. The structure looked the same as every other cabin in the valley from this distance, modest, functional, built from local timber by a man without formal training. There was nothing in its exterior that announced what was happening inside it. That was, perhaps he thought, the most accurate thing about it. The important work in that cabin could not be seen from the outside. It was happening in the stone and the slow arithmetic of heat in mass, in the patient transaction between what was stored and what was released, conducted without drama, without announcement, without any need for the approval of the world. It was quietly exceeding. He turned the horse south and continued toward town. In February, the snow deepened on the valley floor, but the air temperature rose incrementally toward the reliable cold of February rather than the exceptional cold of January's worst week, and the valley's households recovered their equilibrium with the particular industriousness of people who have survived something they expected might defeat them. Pruitt restocked the sandstone inventory and added to the description in his order ledger the notation, "Thermal Mass Residential Application," a phrase that had not appeared in any Idaho General Store's records before, and which he had taken directly from the way Elias had described the material's use when Pruitt asked him what to call it. 3 families began modification work on their existing cabins that month. The Callaway family, who could access Ernest's considerable woodworking skill and whose cabin's interior framing made stone addition feasible, completed the most extensive modification of full secondary stone mass added to the back wall of the primary firebox with an extended flue run that Morse himself came to inspect and pronounced correctly executed. The cabin's overnight temperature performance improved by 11 degrees within the first week. Callaway stood in his kitchen on the first morning after the modification's initial full firing and was quiet for a long time before he went to find his wife and tell her what the thermometer said. Morse and Elias worked through the cabin design for Carter's spring construction across 4 sessions at the kitchen table in February, the design evolving across drafts into something that incorporated the stone core principle cleanly and structurally, not grafted onto an existing design, but integrated into it from the foundation, the way the principle worked best. On the final session, when the drawings were complete enough that Morse was satisfied with them, he rolled them carefully and put them in the leather tube he carried architectural drawings in, and sat with his coffee for a moment. "I've built 41 structures in this county," he said. "This will be the 42nd. It will be warmer than the other 41. He drank the coffee. "I intend to build it that way for whatever time I have left." The letter from Colorado arrived in the 3rd week of February. Elias had sent the envelope in late January, the composition notebook's data copied out in clean hand, the system diagrams redrawn with full dimensions, a cover note that gave the location, the materials, the winter conditions, and the performance results across 47 days of documented operation. He had addressed it to the Colorado School of Mines engineering faculty, to no specific person, because he did not know who was teaching there now and believed the material would find its way to whoever could use it. The reply came from a man named William Aldrich, who identified himself as a lecturer in applied thermal mechanics, 31 years old in his 2nd year on the faculty. He wrote with the precision of someone trained in accuracy and the enthusiasm of someone who has just been handed the answer to a question he had been working around. He wrote that the data Elias had sent represented the first documented residential application of thermal mass storage principles at scale in the American West. He wrote that the system's performance numbers exceeded what his theoretical models had predicted for a structure of this description and construction quality, which suggested either that the stone selection process had been more precise than typical, or that the channel geometry had achieved a heat transfer efficiency above theoretical baseline, possibly both. He wanted to know more. He wanted to understand the channel dimensions in detail. He wanted, with Elias's permission, to use the data in his course materials and to share it with colleagues at other institutions. He asked whether Elias would consider a visit in the summer. Elias read the letter twice at the table with his morning coffee and then put it on the pile of correspondence that occupied one corner of the table. He picked up the composition notebook, opened it to a clean page, and wrote a reply that occupied one side of one sheet of paper. He confirmed that the stone selection had been specific and described the criteria. He confirmed the channel dimensions and provided the rationale for each. He said that Aldrich was welcome to visit at any convenient time and should bring his own measuring instruments because Elias's tape measure was showing wear. He said that the data belonged to whoever could use it to build warmer structures and that there were no conditions on its use. He folded the letter, addressed it, set it beside the envelope to be taken to Pruitt's when he went to town. He sat at the table for a while after that, not with any particular task in front of him. The February light came through the south window at a low angle that was beginning just barely to show the seasonal shift. Still a winter light, still pale and brief, but with the first evidence of the lengthening that came in increments through the month. The stone core occupied its position in the center of the room with the settled presence of something that had found its purpose and was fulfilling it without effort. He had lit a small fire the previous evening. The room was 63 degrees. Outside, the temperature was -6. He thought about the 47 pages of numbers in the composition notebook and about the letter that was going to Colorado, and about Carter Morse's spring cabin with its centered stone core, and about the 3 modified cabins in the valley that were holding temperatures their occupants had not experienced in January before. He thought about Calloway standing in his kitchen on a February morning reading a thermometer. He thought about Morse at a drafting table, drawing something different than he had drawn for 55 years. He thought as he thought most mornings about Margaret, but the quality of that thinking had shifted incrementally since autumn, the way light shifts across the seasons so gradually that no single day contains the change. The accounting of what he had not done in time was still present, would always be present, but it no longer occupied the entire foreground. There was something else in the foreground now, the ongoing fact of what the stone was doing, what the system was doing, what the valley's households would do differently in the coming winters, because of 11 documented days in January and a composition notebook full of numbers that had not required a single editorial comment to make their argument. He was 64 years old. He had damaged shoulder and a nearly full composition notebook and a letter going to Colorado. He had a son who had driven 4 hours in winter conditions to argue with him and 4 hours back without having won the argument and was coming back next month, having asked to understand the system from the beginning. He had a valley that had laughed at him in October and stood in his cabin in January, with its hands on warm stone and its prior positions quietly undergoing revision. He was not finished. He understood that with the particular clarity that comes from having almost not started the clarity of a man who had carried knowledge for 12 years without using it, and was now aware in a way that the carrying had not permitted him to be of how much remained to be done with it. The Clearwater Valley was one valley. Idaho was not a small state. The territories to the east and north had winters that were not more forgiving than the ones he had just documented. There were structures being built right now in a dozen counties on the same principles that had produced the coal cabins he had grown up understanding as simply the natural condition of winter, the condition that required endless fuel and produced insufficient warmth and extracted from every household a cost measured in wood and exhaustion, and sometimes in the kind of outcome that a doctor describes with careful language about temperature and progression and what might have been different. He picked up the composition notebook and turned to the back cover, where he had left several blank pages. He opened to the first of them and wrote a heading in at the top, Notes toward a General Guide Residential Thermal Mass Construction, Practical Application. Below it, he wrote the first line, The principle requires no special materials, no expertise, unavailable to any capable builder, and no tools beyond what standard construction already demands. He wrote for an hour. The fire banked, and the stone held the room at 62 degrees, and the February light moved across the floor as the morning advanced, and outside the valley was doing what it did in February, surviving the remaining weeks of cold, with the wood that remained in the piles, counting the days, in the way that people count days when the thing they are counting toward is something they have been waiting for long enough, that the waiting has become part of their daily practice. In the cabin at the eastern edge, a man who had spent 12 years not asking a question was writing down the answer. He wrote carefully in the same even hand he used for everything, as though the words were data, and the data mattered, and the mattering did not require any particular expression beyond accuracy. The stone worked behind him. The light moved. The cold pressed against the south wall, and found, as it had been finding for 7 weeks, that the wall was not interested in negotiating. He wrote until he ran out of blank pages. Then he put the notebook down and looked out the window at the mountain line and the pale winter sky, and the thin smoke rising from the chimneys of the valley below, some of them thinner than they had been in October in the cabins where the modifications had taken hold, and the stone was learning its work. He sat with that view for a while, not moving, not writing, not calculating. Just sitting in a warm room in February in Idaho, watching the valley's smoke rise straight and quiet into the cold air, and knowing with the settled, undemonstrative certainty of someone who has checked the numbers across 47 days and found them consistent that next winter would be different, and the winter after that. And all the winters that would follow in the structures that Morse would build, and Callaway would modify, and the guide in the composition book would eventually make possible for builders. He would never meet in valleys, he would never visit, who would set stone at the center of a frame and wait for it to warm and find. As he had found that the waiting was shorter than expected, and the warmth was steadier than anything a fire alone had ever managed to produce. He picked up the pen one more time and wrote a final line at the bottom of the last page below the notes below the calculations. The stone does not forget what it has been given. It only needs to be asked. He capped the pen. He put the notebook on the corner of the table where the letter to Colorado was waiting. He stood up and went to the window and stood there for a while with his hand resting on the warm glass, feeling through it the cold that was still outside and through the room behind him, the warmth that was still inside and the long patient distance between the two that the stone had learned across one extraordinary winter to hold. They hit 15 feet on the 29th of October, and the number felt different from the inside than it had from above. Standing at the bottom of the shaft with a lantern in one hand and a plumb line in the other, Marta looked up at the rectangle of pale sky that was all that remained of the surface world, and the distance seemed both greater and more necessary than she had imagined during all the weeks of digging toward it. Owen stood beside her, his breath visible in the still air of the chamber. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The earth pressed close on all four sides with the indifferent patience of something that had been waiting here long before either of them arrived and would continue waiting long after. The ventilation pipes were the first thing Marta addressed the morning after they confirmed the depth. 2 pipes each bored through the roof with a hand auger Owen had brought from his father's tools, one positioned near the trapdoor entrance, one at the far diagonal corner. She fitted each with a wooden sleeve that could be opened or closed by a sliding panel, controlled from below with a cord. The design was simple enough that she had drawn it out on the back of a flour sack 2 weeks earlier, and the execution matched the drawing closely enough to satisfy her, though the bore through the second pipe ran slightly off plumb and required shimming with strips of rawhide to seal cleanly when closed. She borrowed a thermometer from the school teacher in Beaver Creek, a small mercury instrument in a brass casing that the teacher parted with, reluctantly extracting a promise that it would be returned before the first week of December when the school held its winter examination. Marta climbed down the ladder with the thermometer and held it at arm's length in the center of the chamber and waited. The mercury settled at 52 degrees. Too warm. She had known it would be too warm. The earth at this depth ran 50 to 55 without intervention, and the goal was 38 to 40, and the distance between those numbers was the entire purpose of the ventilation system she had just finished building. That night she opened both pipes at dusk and left them open until the sky began to lighten in the east. The following morning she descended and read the thermometer. 46 degrees. Better. She opened the pipes again the next night and sealed them at dawn. By the 4th morning the mercury read 41 degrees, and by the 5th it held at 39, even after a full day of the pipes being sealed while the October sun, weak as it was, worked at the sod roof above. Owen stood on the ladder with his head at floor level, watching her read the thermometer. 39, he said, the number the way you say something you want to confirm is real. Marta looked at the mercury. 39 degrees, 41 at the perimeter near the walls. She turned slowly in the chamber, pressing her palm to each wall in turn. The clay was cool and faintly damp and utterly steady. The walls are holding it. The earth is holding what the night air gave us. Owen was quiet for a moment. Will it stay there through January? She looked at him levelly. We'll know in January. The storing took 2 full days. She had almost lost it herself. There had been years in Red Wing when she had not had a proper root cellar at all. Years when the apartment above the dry goods store had meant storing what little she kept in a corner of the landlord's shallow basement and trusting to luck in a cold pantry. The knowledge had waited. The carrots went into wooden boxes packed with dry straw, oriented with the root ends down to slow the natural process by which carrots sent their energy back toward an absent soil. The cabbages Owen hung from the ceiling joists on lengths of cord, their outer leaves still intact to protect the heads, spaced so none touched another. The preserved plums in their 37 jars went on a shelf along the southwest wall, away from the vegetables and away from the ventilation pipes that brought the coldest air into the northeast corner of the chamber. Owen set the last crate down and stood back and looked at the full cellar for the first time. The lantern threw warm light across the rows of potato bins and the hanging cabbages and the jars of dark preserves, and the chamber smelled of earth and root vegetables and something underneath both of those things, something older and quieter soon, smell of depth itself. My father's cellar, he said slowly, working something out. I remember going down there as a kid. It smelled like mud and rot by February, like the whole thing was slowly going bad. He looked around the chamber. This smells like it's going to last. Marta latched the trap door above them and checked the cord on each ventilation pipe. Both sealed. Both tight. The thermometer read 38 degrees. The potatoes were firm in their bins. The cabbages hung motionless on their cords, and the stillness of the chamber was the stillness of something preserved. Something held at exactly the right temperature between two kinds of ruin. She climbed the ladder and stood in the cold November air and allowed herself a single long breath of something that was not quite relief. Relief implied that the danger had passed and the danger had not passed. The danger was in fact just beginning to organize itself several hundred miles to the northwest, though she did not yet know this and would not know it for another 6 weeks. The cabin roof went up in the week before Thanksgiving. The canvas that had been serving as temporary covering since August came down in sections rolled and stored against the south wall of the cabin for later use. Cottonwood planks went up in their place, laid perpendicular to the rafters, and spiked down with the last of Thomas's iron nails, then covered with a layer of prairie sod, cut from the slope north of the cabin, where the grass had deep roots that held the soil together in workable sections. The sod went down in overlapping rows like shingles. The roots side up, and by the time the last row was laid and tamped, the cabin had stopped being a temporary structure and become something that intended to be there in the spring. The walls needed another week. Marta worked from the outside, pushing dried grass and shredded moss into every gap between the cottonwood logs, while Owen followed from the inside, pressing clay into the spaces from his side until the two materials met somewhere in the middle of each joint, and the cold that had been leaking freely through the walls slowed to an occasional breath. They banked earth 3 feet high against the outside walls on the north and west, faces the directions from which Dakota wine arrived with the most conviction, packing it firm and covering it with more sod to hold it through the freeze. The wood situation did not improve. He stood at the trap door and looked at it and for a moment before he pulled it open and climbed down without being invited. He was down there for considerable time. Marta could hear him moving, the sound of his hand against the wall, the slight creak of the ladder as he shifted his weight, the silence that meant he was reading the thermometer. When he came back up, his face had the expression of a man updating a calculation he had thought was finished. 40 degrees, he closed the trapdoor behind him. How did you bring it down from 52? Marta explained the ventilation system, the pipes, the timing, the way cold air sank and filled the chamber each night, while the earth absorbed and held it through the day. She used no more words than the explanation required. Storrow listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely trying to understand a mechanism rather than looking for the flaw in it. Walter Dent had told him, he said. Then we'll find out what 15 feet is worth. Storrow left without offering anything further, but he did not leave immediately. He stood for several minutes after the conversation ended, looking northwest across the prairie, and Marta stood nearby and looked in the same direction, and neither of them named what they were both considering. The sky to the northwest had a quality she had seen once before. She could not yet say when or where that was. The memory was there, but not yet organized like a word on the edge of recall. December was cold, but within the range of what the territory considered ordinary. The temperature dropped to 12 below on Christmas Eve and held near zero for the first week of January. Marta descended to the cellar every morning before breakfast, read the thermometer, and climbed back up. 38, 39. Once after a mild night, 42, which resolved back to 39 by the following morning, when she opened the ventilation pipes for 2 hours before dawn. The potatoes remained firm in their bins. The carrots, packed in their straw, showed no sign of the limpness that preceded rot. The cabbages hung from their cords, unchanged, as though time were not passing at all in the chamber below. In the other cellars of Beaver Creek, the news was less steady. Ruth Pedersen sent word through a neighbor's boy that her cellar floor had frozen in the second week of January, not the bins, the floor itself, solid clay that had turned to ice from the bottom up, and the cold had crept into the lowest bin and taken 2 bushels of potatoes before she noticed. Walter Dent found ice crystals forming on his turnips and moved everything to the highest shelves and spent 3 days anxious about whether the shelves would be enough. Carl Bergstrom, who checked his own cellar with the systematic confidence of a man whose methods had been validated by 9 years of success, found that the cold had reached 18 inches into his potato supply and was still moving. The settlement talked. In the way that small settlements talk when something is going wrong more broadly than any individual failure can account for, not panic, not yet, but the low, steady hum of people comparing notes and arriving at a consensus that this winter was running colder than the last several, that the frost line was lower than it should be, that the margins they had calculated in August were tighter than they had felt in October. Carl Bergstrom came by in the second week of January. Not to the cabin, he stopped at the edge of the property and looked toward the trap door from a distance, and Marta, who was splitting kindling near the woodpile, watched him stand there for a moment before he turned and walked back toward the road. She did not call out to him. She went back to splitting kindling. Owen had been walking into the settlement twice a week to pick up any available work fence mending, hauling whatever presented itself, and to maintain the awareness of what was happening in the community that Marta regarded as necessary intelligence. He came back on a Thursday in the second week of January with the specific expression of someone carrying news they are not sure how to deliver. He had seen Bergstrom in town. Bergstrom had asked about the cellar temperature. Owen had told him 40 degrees. Bergstrom had been quiet for a moment and then asked how the ventilation worked. "What did you tell him?" Marta was at the stove and she did not turn around. "I told him to ask you." She turned around then and looked at the boy, who was 17 years old and had been working beside her for 3 months and had, without any particular ceremony, become someone she trusted. Good. The morning of January 12th arrived without distinction. The temperature at dawn was 34 degrees above zero, warm for January, notably warm, the kind of warmth that made people in the settlement step outside without their heaviest coats and remark to each other that perhaps the worst had already passed. Children went to school without the full layering their parents usually insisted on. Farmers walked to their barns in lighter boots. The sky was pale and clear, and the sun gave actual light, if not actual warmth, and the whole prairie had the quality of a held breath that no one recognized as a held breath. Marta recognized it. She had been awake before dawn, which was not unusual, but this particular wakefulness had a different quality, not the ordinary insomnia of cold nights and insufficient firewood, but a heightened attention, a physical alertness that she could not immediately account for. She dressed and went outside before the sun was fully up and stood in the yard and looked at the sky. The sky was wrong, not wrong in any way that could be easily described to someone who had not felt it before. The color was ordinary. The clouds were ordinary. The wind was the ordinary light wind of a January morning. But the pressure was wrong. The air had a softness to it, a strange mildness, that her body recognized as a warning before her mind caught up to what her body knew. Her father had called it a weather breeder. The old-timers had a phrase for it, the wolf's smile. The warmth before the killing, cold, the sky opening wide and generous right before it closed on everything underneath it. She had last felt this quality of air in Minnesota in January of 1873, the morning before the storm that froze Eric's cellar and took her brother and changed the course of her life. She went to the cellar first, 38 degrees. She checked both ventilation pipes, sealed cord, taut wooden panels flush. She laid 2 flat stones across the trap door for additional weight against wind-up lift and latched the iron hook she had mounted on the doorframe specifically for this purpose. Then she went to the cabin and told Owen to bring the mules inside. He came to the door of the cabin and looked at the pale, mild, entirely ordinary-seeming January sky. Inside the cabin, every pot and bucket filled with water. Now, she was already moving toward the water barrel. The mules first, then the water. Owen looked at the sky one more time with the expression of someone wanting to find a reason to disagree, and then he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there settled the question. He went to get the mules. The storm came at 2 in the afternoon. It did not build, it arrived the way a wall arrives when you walk into it in the dark. One moment the sky was pale and the air was mild, and the prairie looked the way it always looked, and the next moment the horizon to the northwest had gone black, and the temperature began dropping, and the wind came in a single sustained scream across the open ground, with nothing between it and the cabin to break its speed or reduce its intent. The temperature inside the cabin registered 34 degrees above zero when the storm front hit. Within the first hour, it was 22. Owen fed the stove continuously, pushing cottonwood in every 20 minutes, watching the temperature on the cabin wall thermometer, the way you watch a water level during a flood, the number itself less important than its direction of travel. 12 degrees above, 9 above, 2 above, 0, 6 below. The numbers kept moving in the wrong direction with the mechanical indifference of a thing that cannot be argued with. The wind was the constant, not gusting, not variable, but steady and immense, a force pressing against the cabin walls the way water presses against a dam, looking for the weakness that would eventually be there. The sod roof held. The banked earth on the north wall held. The chinking that Marta and Owen had packed into the log joints in November let through occasional thin, cold drafts that they stuffed with rags as they found them, the two of them moving through the cabin in a deliberate rotation, checking walls, checking the stovepipe joint at the ceiling, checking the base of the door, where cold air sought the lowest point of entry. 18 degrees below zero by nightfall. The mules stood in the far corner of the cabin with the stoic resignation of animals that have decided that the strangeness of their circumstances is preferable to the alternative. The water in the pots and buckets had not frozen the stove heat, held the cabin above the critical threshold, barely consuming wood at a rate that Marta calculated against the woodpile outside and did not share with Owen because the calculation was not useful to share. 5 cords, approximately 40 cubic feet remaining after 2 months of burning. At this burn rate through a storm of unknown duration, she stopped calculating. Some arithmetic had only one function, which was to confirm a fear you already held, and this was one of those calculations. 24 below, 27 below. At some point in the middle of the night, the thermometer on the cabin wall read 31 below zero, a fall of 65 degrees in 7 hours. And the wind was still screaming across the prairie, and the snow was driving horizontally with such force that the sound of it against the window was indistinguishable from the sound of sand. Owen sat beside the stove with his knees pulled up, adding wood with the mechanical regularity of someone who had decided that the act of feeding the fire was the only thing currently within his control and was therefore going to execute it with complete attention. Around midnight, he asked how long a storm could last. Marta was sitting across the cabin with her back against the east wall, and she did not answer immediately. She was thinking about the cellar, thinking about 15 feet of earth and a double-layer sod roof and 2 ventilation pipes that were sealed tight against whatever was happening above them. Thinking about the chamber temperature at 38 degrees and the potatoes firm in their bins and the difference between what was happening outside and what was happening below. The storm could reach down through 3 feet of earth. It could reach down through 4 through 5. She had seen it. She had lived its consequences. But 15 feet. I don't know how long it will last, she said finally, but the cellar will outlast it. Owen looked at the cabin wall where the wind was testing the chinking with a persistence that made the sound of it nearly continuous. How do you know? Marta looked at the stove rather than at him. Because the storm doesn't know the cellar is there. It can only reach what it can touch. 15 feet of earth and a 1,000-pound roof, the storm can't touch it. She paused. My brother died because my father trusted a hole that the cold could reach. I did not build a hole the cold can reach. Owen was quiet for a long time after that. The wind did not quiet. The stove consumed wood at its relentless rate. The temperature outside continued to hold at 31 below zero with the committed certainty of a winter that has decided to demonstrate what it actually is rather than what people have assumed it to be. The storm lasted 3 days. It did not peak and recede the way some storms peak and recede. It held the temperature, and it held the wind, and it held the snow, driving horizontal across the prairie at a concentration that made the air itself more white than clear. On the 2nd May, Marta and Owen could not see the trapdoor from the cabin window. On the 3rd day, the snow had drifted to the roofline on the north side, and the cabin sat inside a white silence that was in some ways more frightening than the noise of the first day, because the silence meant the cold had settled in and was no longer in transit. The wood held, barely and by means of a rationing that brought the cabin temperature down to 48 degrees on the 3rd night, which was cold enough that sleep came in shallow, unreliable increments, and the mules shifted and stamped in their corner with a restlessness that had no outlet. But the wood held and the walls held, and on the morning of the 4th day, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was absolute in the way that very few silences are absolute, the kind that has weight and texture that presses on the ears after days of continuous noise. Marta stood at the cabin door and pushed it open against the snowdrift that had formed against the outside face and looked at a world that had been rearranged. The snow had drifted 6 feet high on the north and west sides of the cabin. The woodpile was invisible under 4 feet of white. The path to the cellar trapdoor was gone, entirely buried under a smooth, unbroken surface that gave no indication of what lay underneath. 27 below zero. The sky was pale blue and entirely cloudless, the sun present and bright and contributing nothing to the warmth of the air, winter sky's particular deception, beautiful and useless. Every surface that had been exposed during the storm carried a crust of hard-packed snow that would not shift without tools. Marta and Owen dug for 2 hours, not toward the woodpile, toward the trapdoor. Marta drove an iron rod into the snow in a grid pattern, probing for the solid resistance of the wooden frame beneath, and when she found it, they dug down with shovels, cutting the snow in blocks, the way you cut sod, stacking the blocks to the sides to clear a working space. The snow was dense and heavy from the temperature, not the light powder of ordinary winter storms, and each shovelful weighed more than it should have. The trapdoor frame emerged from the snow like something that had been buried for a season rather than 3 days. The leather hinges had frozen in the closed position, the leather shrunk and rigid in the extreme cold. Owen poured warm water from the kettle he had carried from the cabin, and the water hit the leather and steamed, and the hinges flexed, and the door lifted on the 2nd try. Marta descended first. The ladder rungs were cold under her hands, but not iced. No moisture had gotten in, which meant the seals had held, which meant everything she had built to keep the storm out had kept the storm out. She went down slowly, counting the rungs the way she had counted them in October to check her work, and at the bottom she stood still for a moment and breathed. The air of the chamber received her face like a damp cloth, cool still, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and the fainter smell of root vegetables undisturbed. Not cold, not the killing cold of the world above, not the thin, desperate warmth of a cabin burning its last reserves of wood, but something steady and middle and permanent, the temperature of the planet's indifference to whatever the surface was doing. She lit the candle she had brought down, tucked inside her coat. The flame burned straight up, without wavering. No draft, no air movement, the chamber sealed and calm. She held the thermometer out at arm's length and waited. 37 degrees. The potatoes sat in their bins, firm and pale and untouched by anything the storm had done. She lifted one and pressed her thumb against the skin, and the skin did not yield. She pulled a carrot from its straw and bent it slightly, and it resisted with the clean resistance of something that had not begun to lose its water. The cabbages hung from the ceiling joists in the same position they had occupied when she latched the trap door 3 days before, motionless, unchanged, utterly indifferent to the 65-degree temperature drop that had happened 15 feet above their heads. Marta sat down on an overturned crate. The candle flame burned straight and patient in the stillness. 37 degrees. She had calculated for this. She had dug for this. She had spent 23 days of her 62-year-old body down in the earth, moving clay bucket by bucket, and she had spent 3 months after that building and finishing and filling and worrying, and she had made a decision in August based on the memory of a 9-year-old boy in a 3-foot cellar and 14 years of carrying the weight of a calculation that her father had not lived long enough to apply. The calculation had been correct. The depth had been sufficient. The earth had done what she had trusted it to do. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and cried, not the crying of relief because the danger was not over. The stores were intact, but winter was not done, and the settlement beyond her property line had 3-foot cellars, and she did not yet know what the storm had cost them. What she felt was something older than relief and less simple, the specific emotion of a person who has been carrying a debt to the dead for 14 years and has just made the first payment toward it. Owen's voice came from the top of the shaft, Marta. His tone told her something before the words did. I can see the Pedersen place from up here. Their cellar door is open. She looked up at the rectangle of pale winter sky at the top of the ladder. 37 degrees in the chamber. Ruth Pedersen's cellar door standing open in 27 below zero air, which meant the cold had gotten in, which meant what the cold always meant when it got into a root cellar in the middle of January. She climbed the ladder toward the light.